There is a photograph taken on the 24th of January, 1967, that has been used to illustrate almost every article ever written about the tunnel rats. A young sergeant crouched at the mouth of a Viet Cong tunnel. No helmet, no body armor, no shirt, a pistol in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Then that single image became the internet's shorthand for the entire job. Proof that these men went underground, half naked, as a matter of routine. Half of that is true. The other half is one of the most repeated mistakes about this war, and the real reason they stripped down is stranger than the photo suggests. Nobody was paying much attention to the ground under South Vietnam in the early years. American commanders were planning for a war of helicopters and artillery and battalion sweeps, a war fought across the surface of the country. The Viet Cong had spent since 1946 digging in the opposite direction, first against the French, then against everyone who came after. By the time American combat troops arrived, entire districts had a second country underneath them. That changed in January 1966 on an operation called Crimp. According to the United States Army Intelligence Center of Excellence, 8,000 troops moved into the Hobo Woods northwest of Saigon, including the 1st Infantry Division and an attached Australian battalion. They were looking for a Viet Cong headquarters. What they found instead was a tunnel system that ran, by the estimate recorded for that operation, to more than 200 kilometers. The tunnels were not caves. The National Museum of the United States Army describes the typical passage as roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, a space you enter one man at a time, on your elbows, in total darkness. They were dug on multiple levels, with sharp turns built in, so that a grenade blast would spin itself against a corner instead of traveling down the corridor. There were trapdoors, blast walls, and sections deliberately flooded to trap gas or drown whoever crawled into them, and somebody had to go down there. The first men who did it were not American. Captain Alexander McGregor commanded 3 field troop, Royal Australian Engineers, and during Crimp, his sappers made what the Australian War Memorial and the Australian Army's own professional forum both describe as the first systematic Allied entries into the Cu Chi system. The standing instruction at the time was to blow tunnels shut and move on. McGregor's men did the opposite. They went in with telephone cable and compasses and mapped what was down there. He was awarded the Military Cross for it. It cost them almost immediately. On the 11th of January 1966, Corporal Robert Botel was working his way along a cramped passage when smoke and tear gas were pushed down from above to flush out anyone hiding. Botel became wedged in a floor trap door. The Australian War Memorial's account is specific about what happened next. He dislodged his respirator while trying to free himself, and with the smoke consuming the oxygen in the passage, he asphyxiated. Private Jim Daly went in after him 4 separate times and worked almost to the point of collapse before he was ordered out. Botel was 33 years old. His 4th child was born 4 months later. Read that sequence again, because it explains everything that follows. The gas did not kill him. The mask did not save him. What killed him was a confined space with no air in it and equipment that got in the way. That is the logic the entire job was built on. Start with the helmet, because that part of the premise is accurate, and the reason is not the one people assume. It was not about weight. A steel helmet in a passage 2 feet wide does 3 things, all of them bad. It scrapes the roof and announces you. It stops you turning your head, which underground is the difference between seeing a trapdoor and crawling straight over it. And it deadens your hearing at the exact moment your hearing is the only warning system you have left. Gordon Rotman, a Vietnam veteran and the author of the most detailed study of the tunnel rats ever published, writes that most of them went in bareheaded specifically, so they would have unrestricted vision and hearing, accepting a few knocks on the skull as the price. The 25th Infantry Division's own museum records the same thing, that helmets were sometimes worn going in and then discarded once the space closed around them. Now understand what happens if the man down there has to fire. Rotman describes firing a .45 caliber pistol inside a tight tunnel as deafeningly painful. The sensation of nails being driven into your ears, and something that caused permanent hearing damage. The National Museum of the United States Army puts the tactical cost plainly. The round was too loud and the muzzle flash too bright, so a man who fired lost both of the senses he was navigating with, in the dark, in a space he could not stand up in, for several seconds. Some tunnel rats carried a .38 revolver instead, borrowed off a machine gunner, purely because it was quieter, and still, almost none of them wore ear protection. They would rather take the hearing loss than lose the ability to hear someone breathing 40 feet ahead of them. So the helmet came off for the same reason the earplug stayed in the pocket. Anything that dulled a sense was a liability, and armor is useless against a tripwire anyway. Which brings us to the shirt. And here the story the internet tells starts to come apart. Removing web gear was universal. Every account agrees on this. The load-bearing equipment, the ammunition pouches, the flak jacket, all of it came off at the entrance, because a man wearing it physically will not fit and cannot crawl. The shirt is a different question, and Rotman gives a different reason for it. Fatigue shirts had cargo pockets and loose sleeves that caught on roots and timber and the lip of a trapdoor. So many men took them off. But his reading of the photographic record is that most tunnel rats went under wearing boots, trousers, and an undershirt. Bare-chested happened. It was one option among several, not a uniform. So where did the shirtless image come from? Largely from a handful of press photographs, and above all from that one picture of Sergeant Ronald Payne of the 25th Infantry Division during Operation Cedar Falls. It is a real photograph of a real practice. It is not evidence that every man in every tunnel did the same thing, and the museums that hold it do not claim that it is. Here is one of the men who actually did this work describing it in his own words, because it lands harder than any description I can write.
When we come across a tunnel, and it'd only maybe be this big around, and being 5'6", 130 pounds wet, I was designated the tunnel rat, and I'd take my .45 pistol and a flashlight, and I'd crawl in these tunnels.
That clip is from the Vietnam Experience, a channel that vets the service records of every veteran it interviews. Notice what he lists: a pistol and a flashlight. That is the whole loadout, and it is worth pausing on, because it tells you how little margin these men were operating with. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the sourced version rather than the algorithm's version, subscribing is the single thing that helps most. Right? So what else went down the hole? Not much, and that was deliberate. The flashlight was usually the standard right-angle army torch, and this is where you can watch the job being learned in real time. Look closely at that famous Payne photograph, and there is no colored filter on his light. Within a couple of years that had changed, and the reason is almost unnervingly practical. The Viet Cong used white light and candles down there, so American rats switched to a red lens. White light coming toward you meant a friendly. Anything else meant you had a problem. Beyond that, a knife or a bayonet for probing floors and prying at trapdoors, and a sound-powered field telephone trailing communications wire back to the entrance so the team above ground knew whether the man below was still alive. Gas masks were often carried and frequently abandoned for the reason Botel's death demonstrated. They protected against tear gas and nothing else, and they took away vision, hearing, and easy breathing in exchange. Which brings us to the part where the record and the internet part company completely. You will find it stated confidently that the life expectancy of a tunnel rat was 7 seconds. It appears in articles, in comment sections, in video after video. There is no source behind it. It has been repeated by some veterans, which is how it acquired credibility, but no study, unit record, or archive produces it, and even the aggregator sites that circulate the number now concede it is an exaggeration. Rotman, working from the unit records, reaches close to the opposite conclusion, describing below-ground casualties among tunnel rats as surprisingly light. If that were the only inflated number, it might not matter much. But there is a second one, and this one is more interesting because it started out true. You have probably seen the claim that 1 in 3 tunnel rats was killed or wounded. That figure is real. It comes from Jim Moret, an Australian sapper who wrote about his own service, and he is describing roughly 700 Australian engineers and tunnel rats who served between 1965 and 1972, of whom he says around 36 were killed and about 200 wounded. Moret also says something the reposts always leave out. Most of those casualties happened above ground, from mines and booby traps, not in the tunnels. A specific and honest figure about one nation's engineers has been stripped of its context and applied to every man who ever went underground. The third one is a piece of hardware. Search for tunnel rat weapons, and you will be told they carried a silenced .44 Magnum revolver built for the job. That weapon existed. It was called the Quiet Special Purpose Revolver, developed at the United States Army Land Warfare Laboratory, firing a captive piston cartridge loaded with tungsten pellets that brought the report down to roughly the level of a loud hand clap. 23 revolver frames were bought for conversion. The first 10 reached Vietnam for field trials in 1969, and the program was canceled in 1972, with most of the weapons recalled and destroyed. 10 guns in a war that ran for a decade. The overwhelming majority of tunnel rats went down with a standard .45 borrowed from whoever had one. But this was never only about equipment. It shapes how the men themselves get remembered. There was never a tunnel rat military occupational specialty. Rotman is blunt about it, writing that there were no tunnel rat units as such, only ad hoc teams and volunteering individuals, which is exactly why the records are so thin. Infantrymen, combat engineers, and chemical corps soldiers pulled together wherever the tunnels were, usually working in threes with one man below and the others on the wire. The lone rat in the dark is true for the moment of contact and false as a description of the operation. Selection came down to size. Under 5'6", wiry, and able to tolerate a coffin-sized space for an hour without panicking. Some gave up smoking and gum because they wanted their sense of smell intact down there. John Baker, who later received the Medal of Honor, stood 5'1" and did this work. They gave themselves a motto in deliberately terrible Latin, non gradum anus rodentum, not worth a rat's backside, which tells you roughly how they felt about the assignment, and roughly how funny they found it. So the answer to the question is not that they were reckless, and not that the Army ordered them to strip. In a space that narrow protection and perception are in direct competition, and perception wins every time. A helmet cannot stop a booby trap. It can absolutely stop you hearing one. The men who worked that out were not following doctrine. They were adapting faster than the Army could write it down, and the record of what they learned survives mostly in photographs and in the memories of men who spent the rest of their lives avoiding small rooms. Steve Strand still needs sedation to get through an MRI. Bob Botel's remains came home to Australia in 2016, 50 years after he died in that trapdoor. Both of those facts are the same story. If this is the kind of history you think deserves getting right, the best thing you can do is subscribe, because it tells the algorithm to show sourced work to somebody else who cares. Thanks for watching.